everyone, welcome to another workshop presented to you by the Writing Support Center. My name is Genesis. I'm one of the faculty here at the Writing Support Center, and today we're going to be talking about reacting to reading, how to draw conclusions. If you are in a class that requires you to read articles or a textbook, part of that process is you developing ideas and opinions and essentially being able to interpret the information and make your own and come to your own understanding regarding the topic. So today we're going to be discussing a couple of strategies on how to do that. Before we get into the workshop, I do want to review some expectations that will help you get the most out of this workshop. So to begin, please make sure to complete the accompanying activity worksheet that can be found in the module. This worksheet just provides a couple of activities for you to do that'll help you put the strategies into practice and also provide you with some reflection in order to help you process the information that we discuss. If you are completing this workshop as extra credit or for a class assignment, you do need to complete the worksheet in order to get credit for it. So please make sure to do that. And secondly, we also encourage you to take your time. Feel free to pause and rewind parts that were confusing or went too fast. That's the beauty of a workshop video, is that you get to decide at what pace you want to take this workshop at. So an overview of today's discussion, we're going to be talking about 3 different strategies for how to read and develop interpretations and come to understanding with the reading. So the first is drawing conclusions and looking specifically at the I read, I think, therefore strategy. The second is making judgments, which entails looking at both sides. And then we'll have a finding answers in the text. How do you find answers through your reading? And then finally, we're going to have an activity along with a summary of what we've discussed. So our first strategy is to help you draw conclusions. And one thing to keep in mind is that readers draw conclusions based on ideas and information that you have read from one or more sources. So this is often a result of everything that you have learned. So when you're putting together your ideas, when you're coming to an opinion or coming to a conclusion, you are putting together all of the ideas that you have read from the multiple articles that have been assigned in the class, information that you've gone over in the class, information from your textbook, etc. And all of that is to help you come up with what might eventually be your thesis or help you interpret the information that you've gone over in order to help you prepare for a test that's coming up in your class. If you have watched any of our other previous workshops, reading workshops, you will have noticed that we always refer to reading as an active process, meaning that you are working before, during, and after your reading. So before you start reading, it's important to use your prior knowledge and experiences to think of questions for the text, review the purpose for the reading. So are you reading this because it's to help you prepare for a test? Are you reading in order to prepare for an essay? Is there a prompt? Are there questions that the professor has given you? Using all of that information will help guide you as you're reading, and really just help you develop your ideas and make the reading more guided as opposed to just going through it for the sake of going through it. And then we also encourage you to preview the text to help you get ready to read. So this means reviewing an abstract. If there's a chapter summary, review a chapter summary. I also find it very helpful to look at the introduction and the conclusion before I actually go into the the body paragraphs, just because then I'm able to see what argument the author is setting up, and then the conclusion will obviously will give you some um, summary of how the author supported their thesis. So then you'll have all that information, and then as you go through the body paragraphs, you're able to just start filling in the blanks a little more. During the reading, we encourage you to read the text and then pause to record important information. So this includes any key lines, any statistics, any statements or arguments that the writer is making, and make inferences, which are educated guesses. So come up with your own interpretation for what you think this information means. And all of this is to really just help you not just deepen your understanding, but it will also help you when you're writing the essay, because you will have all the key information from the reading, and it'll be easier for you to transfer that information into your essay writing. And then after you're done reading, it's important to review your notes, draw conclusions based on the information that you've read, and any inferences that were made, and compare your conclusions with those of others. So really just seeing how others interpreted the reading. Was there something you missed? Was there something that they missed? And then through that conversation, you're going to deepen your understanding of the article or the chapter that you've read. One of the strategies that can help you to draw conclusions and really help you develop an opinion or interpretation of an article is the I read, I think, therefore strategy. And this is a strategy for during and after your reading. So as you read, take note of what are the key lines that you are finding as you read. And when you take note of those lines, begin to think about, what do these key lines mean? Why did you choose it? Why are they important? How do they support the writer's main idea? And overall, how does what you already know relate to this article? So how does this key line that you chose relate to knowledge that you've talked about in the class, your own personal experiences, etc.? And from there, you're able to create a therefore. And this is what you do when you're done, when you're finished reading the article. You want to review what you've read and your notes, and really start thinking about, what are your conclusions? What do you know now after reading this article? Do you agree with the author? Was there something that was missing that the writer could have talked about? And this process is essentially helping you prepare your quotes and analysis for your essay writing. So if you're going to have an essay that's going to require you to use the article that you've read, by choosing the key lines, you already have some potential quotes. The I think is helping you come up with your analysis and interpretation of the quote that you chose, and the therefore will help you develop your thesis and support your thesis along the way. On the screen, you will see a graphic organizer. So this graphic organizer is split into two columns. One half has the I read, so this is where you will keep note of the key lines that you have noted. On the right, it says I think, so this is where you will write in your thoughts, your interpretation. And then at the bottom, it says therefore, and this is where you will write your conclusions, your interpretation, and your arguments. It's helpful to have something like this, or set up something similar on your computer, or your notebook, just because it'll help keep your thoughts organized, and it'll have a single space for you to continuously reference, which will be really helpful if for when you're writing the essay for your class. And then again, it'll just give you a place to go to when you want to integrate quotes into the essay. Our second strategy is making judgments looking at both sides. You increase your understanding by reviewing what you've read, reflecting on what you've learned, and asking questions. So, again, reading is an active process and it happens before, during, and after you read your article or your textbook. So, it's important that you have these strategies that you're doing at each stage. And one thing to keep in mind is that every single time that you're reading something that's argumentative, there's usually two sides to the story. There's two arguments that are happening. And so before you make your argument, it's important for you to look at those two sides and really see what the arguments are for both of them and how they're supported. So this is really helpful if you're doing an argumentative essay, but of course, this can be applied to any kind of writing, whether it's informative or analytical, etc. So before you start reading, recall what you already know about the issue or the topic and recall information and existing opinions. Make a note of that just so that you have that understanding before you get into the reading. A lot of times, articles um, or books will make an assumption that they're speaking to an audience that already has some knowledge about the topic. So just making sure that you review what you already know can help prepare you for the reading. Review any notes from the class that you may have learned, which can help set up the reading. And then again, preview the text, make predictions, and discuss with classmates what you all think will be happening. And then while you're reading, you're going to read the selection and ask questions about the information, such as what's the viewpoint? Does this support or oppose a certain topic? How is the writer supporting it? Are they doing a good job at supporting it? Are they appealing more to emotion? Are they appealing more to logic? How are they approaching it? Those kinds of questions will just be really helpful as you interpret whether or not a writer is doing a good job at defending or arguing against something. And then be sure to identify the opinion or viewpoint presented in the selection and how it's supported. And then once you're done reading, compare notes with classmates and evaluate the evidence, make a judgment based on the information, your educated guesses and your own knowledge. And from there, use all of that information to develop an opinion and decide what side you're on, which would be helpful if you're writing an argumentative essay. Similar to the I read, I think, therefore, it's really helpful to have a graphic organizer or something that'll just help you keep track of what it is that you're looking at. So on a separate piece of paper or on your computer, set up a type of graphic organizer where at the top or in the middle, you identify what the question or the statement is that you're looking at. On one side, label it evidence that supports, and that's where you would keep track of all the evidence that is in support of that question or that statement. On the other side, make note of evidence that opposes, so label it that, and that's where you would write down where that evidence is. And then below that, you would write what your decision is, and underneath that, you would explain why. You would give your reasons. And you don't have to write full out sentences with these graphic organizers. It's really just to help you keep track of what your thoughts are. And so that way, when you put it together for your essay, you have these notes that are just ready to be plugged in. But they don't have to be complete sentences. You can just do bullet points or short phrases. All right, so now that we've reviewed two strategies, we're gonna go into a reading activity. So complete this activity on the accompanying worksheet found in the module. And what you're going to do is select one of the readings that you have for a class. It could be any class, and choose either the I think I read therefore or the looking at both sides strategies. Using the strategy you chose, read through your reading for about 10 minutes and then take notes using the templates provided. So you're going to take your reading, go through it a little bit, make sure that you're taking notes, and then use the strategies that we've discussed and create your own graphic organizer or just, you know, make note of it on the document that's been provided. Our next and final strategy is clues for finding answers in the text. So this is particularly helpful if you're doing a reading response or if you have a test or a quiz coming up based on a chapter reading or reading an article. And you know, it asks you to do more, it asks you to do more of a deeper reading um, of the article that was assigned. So there's 4 different ways to find those answers. And the first is on the lines. This is information that is presented directly in the text, meaning that the author said it's there in front of you. You don't really have to read between the lines or go through or make your own educated guess. It is what the author is saying. Questions that are asking for this type of information um, or question starters that are asking for this type of information include give um, give a reason for XYZ, list what the writer thinks, find, describe, tell, retell, and what. So all of those questions starters, if you see a question starting with one of these words, chances are it's asking you to look for the information directly in the text. And you want to use words from the question to help you find the answer because it's the question will usually tell you what it's looking for, and then from there you're able to use that as a guide to help you skim through the article. And you want to be sure to look at other words in the sentence just to make sure that you find the answer. On the other hand, we have between the lines. So you may have heard the expression, oh, you have to read between the lines. This means that the information isn't presented to you directly, but rather it is implied. So you have to make a guess based off the information that the writer has presented to you. And questions that are asking you to read between the lines may begin with why, how, might, what do you think, explain, predict, and what might. And so you're going to use keywords and clues in the question in order to help you find the answer in the reading. And it's also when you find an area that could potentially answer that question, be sure to reread that part of the text in which the author gives clues needed to construct the answer, just to make sure that you're refreshing your memory and have an understanding of what the writer is saying in that part. Next, we have among the lines. So this is kind of similar to uh, the on the lines strategy where the answer is in the text, but it requires more than one sentence or paragraph. So you're going to be writing a little more of an extensive response. So it might require you to read a little more of the section rather than just looking for a simple sentence. Questions that begin with list, compare, how, and summarize, those are the questions that tend to require you to read among the lines. And to answer these questions, you want to make sure that you find the words used to create the question. Again, that'll just help you skim through the article and find what you're looking for. Reread the sentences or paragraphs that contain the question words. So again, just making sure that you're rereading, refreshing your memory, and making sure that you have an understanding of what the author was saying. And then look at the other words in the sentences or paragraphs to find the answer, because this might require a little more information than just finding one sentence that answers your question. And then finally, we have beyond the lines, which if there's a question that asks you to read beyond the lines, you're actually applying your own knowledge to the article. So this is a little more analytical, and these are the types of questions that ask for analysis and demonstrate your understanding and your interpretation of the reading. Questions that will be asking you to read beyond the lines start with, what can you learn from? How might you? What if? And is it fair that? Uh, and when you're answering these questions, you want to read the question and identify keywords. Use those keywords to find areas in the article if you need to use the article to support your ideas. And identify your beliefs, experiences, and knowledge that relate to the question in order to be able to answer it. And you can also ask yourself, would the author agree? So, again, reading beyond the lines really just refers to more so you applying your own analysis and interpretation of the reading rather than looking for a specific answer that the writer has included. So now we're going to go into activity number 2 on the accompanying worksheet. And this is a reflection. So now that you have learned some strategies for reading, which one are you most likely to use? How come? Do you feel more comfortable forming opinions and coming to conclusions when you're reading an article? How will these strategies help you when writing your essays? So take some time to reflect, really think about which of these strategies you feel most comfortable starting off with, which one you would like to try in the future, and how you plan and how you feel like they're going to help you with your essays. All right, so as a summary, these strategies will help you create conclusions in response to your reading. If you're writing any sort of research-based article, you're going to have to do some reading and create your understanding and interpretations of those readings. And your experiences and knowledge are going to help inform that. So don't discredit your own experiences, your knowledge that you have learned outside of this particular class. All of that information could potentially help you in understanding a certain article. Remember that reading is an active process and it requires planning and reflection before, during, and after. So, hence why all of these strategies that we have discussed usually have action steps for the before, during, and after. Before making a decision, be sure to compare all of the information that is available. So really just taking a look at all sides. Um, when you're coming to conclusions, you can use the I read, I think, therefore strategy, where you use the text to inform your understanding and opinions. And then always keep in mind that the text provides a lot of information in different ways. So make sure that you're reading between, among, and beyond the lines in order to create your understanding and come to your conclusions. As always, if you ever need any support or would like some help integrating your quotes or your analysis into your essays, you're more than welcome to come to the Writing Support Center. We are open Monday through Thursday from 9 a.m. to 7 p.m. and on Fridays from 9 a.m. to 2 p.m. It's as simple as clicking a button on our webpage that says Meet with a Tutor. And once you're there, one of our staff members will happily assign you to one of our tutors. Thank you so much, and we hope to see you again soon. Bye, everyone.